Welcome back to day number 5 of our Plan and Have Your Best Garden Ever. If you missed any of the previous days, I have links to the videos beneath this video, and you want to make sure that you are signed up to get all of the free charts and worksheets and additional resources at melissaknorris.com/my-best-garden. So if you have been going through this challenge and series with me, you have got so much of your work already done and ready to go. And I hope you're as excited as I am for this year's garden. And it is going to be your best garden ever. So we know which varieties are going to be working best in your area, the foods that you need, and how many of each plant to put in to take your family through a whole year. You've picked out your varieties, and you already have your dates to know when you're going to be direct sowing them and if you're going to be seed starting, and you've got it all plugged in so you know exactly when to do all of these tasks so that you don't miss any of those important dates and you don't miss out on any of your crops. So today we need to go through picking the best spot to actually plant all of your crops and your plants, as well as some easy ways to get a jump start either in the spring so that you can get some of those directly outside and growing and in the ground even sooner, as well as in the fall so that you can extend that growing season and have some of those fresh produce available to you without preserving it. Though preserving definitely is something that we do a lot of, and I hope that you get into as well. So you already know what your gardening zone is, as well as those first and last average frost dates, because that's what we've been planning everything around. But every piece of property, every home, every yard also has things that are called micro zones or little microclimates. And you can take advantage of these areas by putting your crops in them that are going to help those crops give you, a lot of times, and if you live in a southern climate where it's really hot, then you're going to want to take advantage of microclimates that offer a little bit more of a cooler environment for those plants that struggle where it's hot. On the flip side, if you live in a northern climate like me, where sometimes you struggle to have enough heat and enough dry areas for plants, then you're going to know how to look at and evaluate and pick some of those microclimates that offer more protection and more heat than other areas. So let's go through what the 4 areas that every single property has to some degree or another. So there's 4 major ones. First up is southern exposure. So this is going to be the area where you get the most of the sun is coming on your southern exposure. It's going to get the absolute hottest. It has the least amount of shade. And sometimes just putting a plant in a southern exposure area means it living and thriving for, maybe it might be that season if it's an annual, but especially if it's a perennial. So for example, our southern exposure is right off the back of our house. We've got a back deck and it gets full sun all day long. It's facing the south. My rosemary plant, which rosemary is a perennial in many gardening zones, especially if you're 8 or higher. And I'm gardening zone 7, though occasionally we get a little bit cooler when you're looking at those minimal temperatures from gardening zone, which was video number 2. When I had my rosemary plant out in my regular annual vegetable garden, every single year, didn't matter if I put straw on it or whatever I did to it to kind of help insulate it, my rosemary plant would die and it never ever made it through. I had to always put a new rosemary plant in until I put it in a black container. So I moved it from being in ground into a black container and put that container right at our back deck where it got that southern exposure. Now I've had the same rosemary plant coming back, never dying, year after year after year. It's going on 8+ years that I've had this same rosemary plant, whereas before I never had one make it through a winter. So that is the power of a microclimate and microzone, and just simply moving one plant to a different can make all the difference. So for those of us in cooler climates, you definitely want to take advantage of that southern exposure. If you're in a really hot climate, then you're probably going to avoid putting a lot of your plants in that area. Now, next up after our southern exposure, we have eastern exposure. So this gets the very first light in the morning, but usually by mid or late afternoon, it's moved into the shade. So this can be a great place for a little bit less heat tolerant plants. And in the eastern exposure, that's where I keep my mint and my sage and it performs beautifully in that area. Western exposure can also be really good. So this is an area that typically doesn't get the early morning light, but it's going to get late morning, mid-afternoon, and then it gets sunlight all the way through until sunset. So this is really good for plants that require a lot of light and will tolerate that higher temperatures in the afternoon or like a little bit more heat. Then fourth is your northern exposure, which typically doesn't get a lot of daylight. It's going to be the coolest area. So plants that don't like a lot of heat will grow well in shade. They do really well in a northern exposure. But it's important to note that most fruits and vegetables require at least 6+ hours of full sunlight. So there's not a lot of vegetables and fruits that are going to grow in a deep northern exposure, except we have wild blackberries that grow here where I live. In fact, they're deemed by the county as a noxious weed because they are so invasive. And in our deepest northern exposure area, which is at the front of our house, with the way the peaks of our roof go, that very rarely gets any sun, even in the middle of summertime, I do have blackberry plants that will sprout up and will actually produce a very small amount of blackberries before I rip them out every year because I don't want them growing there. Blackberries, especially they're not native actually to our area, unfortunately, which is why they're so invasive. But they, I have found, will grow here, even in the Pacific Northwest, even in the deep northern exposure. But most of your fruits and vegetables are not going to do very well in that northern exposure because, like I said, they need 6+ hours of sunlight to really flourish and grow well. So you're going to want to go through and look at your property. Just take some time and, kind of go out in the morning, go out in the afternoon, go out in the evening, and see when different areas of your yard and your property, when they have light and when they don't, when some areas feel cooler, some areas feel hotter. Now, of course, if you're doing this in the middle of winter or early spring, remember that sun is going to change positions. So in the middle of summertime, you likely will have sun hitting the eastern area earlier, obviously, than in the middle of winter, as well as having more daylight on that western exposure, etc., than you do in the spring, as you do in winter and in the early spring months. So it's important to take that into account, but it can be a great even to do it now to give you an idea of some of those different areas and where you want to position and put your plants in. So speaking of using those microclimates to your advantage, and sometimes it'll make the difference in a plant living and surviving and it dying, you also can take advantage of some different season extenders. So season extenders can be as simple as a clear plastic tote upside down over an area. And even in the beginning, when it's a small plant or a small seeds, using a wide mouth mason jar to create a protection area. It's going to help keep frost off. It's going to help heat up the soil. And you're creating basically a little mini greenhouse. So you can, of course, go bigger. And you can see where we have got our larger greenhouse, and you can do cold frames. And all of them you can do fairly easily. But you can get a jump start of even a couple of between 2 to 3 weeks of putting things in earlier by using some of those season extenders versus not using them at all. So you'll want to go through your list of the crops that you're putting in and see if any of those are going to be a good candidate to try using some season extenders on, especially if you pair it with your microclimates to its best advantage. Some other things to consider is, are you going to be doing raised beds? Are you going to be doing containers? Are you going to be doing in-ground gardening? Are you going to be doing some vertical gardening? We use all of these different things on our property based on, like I shared, the microclimates and the microzones, which I gave you the 4 basic ones that most every single property does have. And we also go more in depth in the book as well, helping you identify even further some different areas that you can use to your advantage. I am so oh my gosh, I am not sure what I am. I am so glad that you joined me for this free 5-day challenge, and I hope that you have done all of the different worksheets and assignments so that you are set up to have your absolute best garden year ever. I've armed you with a ton of the free worksheets and charts to help you do that, and if you want to dive in further with more step-by-step tutorials and pictures, you're going to want to make sure that you get a copy of the Family Garden Plan, including all of the step-by-step videos that you get as bonuses when you get your copy. So you're going to want to go and check that out at familygardenplan.com. Let me know in the comments below if you enjoyed this series and if you are ready for your best garden year ever. I want to know the 2 crops that you are going to be growing, including varieties, to produce a year's worth of those crops for your family. Thank you so much and happy gardening.